Hey everybody, welcome back to the Revelation Bible Study. I'm Argle Smith. Today we got an exciting Bible study. We're going to be going over Revelation chapter 17, Babylon's Prostitute. Last week we took a break from the Revelation study and we had our theological interlude. We took a look at the post-tribulation view of eschatology. We finished up our section on premillennialism with that. And so this week we are getting right back into Revelation, right in the middle of that chiasm we've been studying. And remember, if you haven't been following along with these studies, just go back and watch the rest of the videos because Revelation builds upon itself. So with that, let's do a little bit of review from where we left off last time in Revelation. So, last time we left off in Revelation chapter 16, we studied the bowls of wrath, the 7 bowls of wrath. If you remember, each bowl represented a plague that was brought upon the world by God. These were judgments brought upon the world by God himself. And the word plague means to be struck or to be hit. And so the mankind received the first blow. And then the second bowl of wrath was the ocean, and then the fresh water supply, and then the sun, and then Babylon, the kingdom of the Antichrist, and then Armageddon is prepared by the demonic forces, and then we had an interlude, a word from our sponsor, who was Jesus. And remember, the interludes in Revelation, they try to answer an important question. What about us? What's going to happen to us, Lord? So the interludes are there in the midst of these 3 sets of 7 judgments, the seals, the trumpets, and the bowls of wrath. They're there to answer that question for the church. What's going to happen to the church during this time period? And so Jesus this time gives us an answer. Jesus wants us to be watching the signs, and he wants us to be ready. And then finally, the 7th bowl is poured out, and that's God's weapon of mass destruction. The bowl is thrown into the world, into the air, and so it's apocalyptic, meaning game over. That's the end of the age. And so that pretty much brings us up today. And remember, we are in this chiasm here. And so, so far we have studied A, B, C, D, E, the center. And so we finished up the center of the chiasm last time with the bowls of wrath. And so remember, the center is the most important part of the chiasm. And basically, we've watched God deliver his final judgments upon the world, starting from 12, gradually progressing into chapter 14 and 15 and 16. Well, so now it's time for John to start backing his way out of the chiasm. And so we are going to be looking at section D today. So section D, which encompasses 16, 19, we've already discussed that, through 17 and 18, and some of 19. Well, that's all section D there, and that corresponds with section D from above. So we've already seen Babylon in chapter 14, verse 8. We saw the prophetic, we saw the prophecy of the angel saying Babylon is fallen. We saw Babylon fall in the bowls of wrath. It was the 5th bowl. And so chapter 14 then was the prophecy. What we're looking at today is a more in-depth look at the fall of Babylon. So we saw the prophetic call. So we saw the fall prophesied in verse 8 of chapter 14. Then we saw the 5th bowl poured out, which destroyed Babylon in chapter 16, verses 10 and 11. So Babylon is destroyed, but we're backing out now. And so now we're going to kind of zoom in on that destruction and see what exactly happened during the 5th bowl in chapter 17 and 18. So today we're going to look at chapter 17. And next week we'll look at chapter 18. What's interesting about Babylon is that it encompasses a lot of space in the book of Revelation. About an eighth of the book of Revelation is dedicated to this kingdom of an Antichrist, Babylon. And so there's about 50 verses in the book of Revelation that is dedicated to this kingdom of the Antichrist. So with that, let's Babylon has its roots that go back into the early nation of Babel, back in Genesis chapters 10 and chapters 11. And so, and then Babel continued to grow. You know, it's modern day Iraq, Iran area, Mesopotamia, and eventually Babylon conquered Israel and Judah. So, thus Babylon occupies a lot of the information we read about in the Old Testaments, in the prophets. Basically, Babylon has existed in every single age and time as a kingdom that is basically ruled by evil that opposes God's kingdom. And we see that in every single age. Babylon becomes the center of Satan's Persia. So Satan's kingdom, his political, his religious rule, his economic rule, his social rule, his intellectual rule, everything about the Antichrist is centered on Babylon. But that leaves a big question that needs to be asked. Where is Babylon? Now, that is a mysterious question that we're going to talk about today. And it's a question that will remain, in my opinion, it will remain unanswered until that time comes. There's been so many guesses over who is Babylon. The preterists, they say, it could be Israel. It could be, in the Antichrist was possibly Nero or Domitian, who is ruling at the time that John's writing this letter. You know, historians say it's the Roman Empire, or some other empire that they point to. The spiritualists say, hey, there's a Babylon in every age, which we kind of discussed. And then there's the futurists that say it's the future kingdom of the Antichrist. So I've heard everything. The Catholic Church, the Protestant reformers said the Catholic Church was Babylon, and Seventh-day Adventists today say the Christian Church is Babylon. So there's a lot of guesses out there. So let's get into this today and see if we can get closer to the answer. So let's get started with chapter 17, verse 1. One of the 7 angels who had poured out the 7 bowls came over and spoke to me. Come with me, he said, and I will show you the judgment that is going to come on the great prostitute who rules many waters. And so it's almost like John is now having a vision inside of a vision. We've seen this in the past with John. You kind of have these visions inside of a vision. It's kind of like when you're asleep and you have a dream inside of a dream. Have you ever had a dream where you were dreaming and then you woke up, but you're still in a dream, and then you wake up from that dream and you're like, whoa, that was weird. I had a dream inside of a dream. That's kind of like what's happening here, a vision within a vision. And so he sees one of the angels who has poured out the bowls of wrath, probably the angel who poured out the bowl of wrath on Babylon. And Babylon was the 5th bowl that was poured out. And so this possibly could be that angel. But one of those angels that poured out the bowls of wrath, these priestly-like angels, came over to John in the vision. And he said, he says, come with me. He's going to now show him what happened to Babylon when that bowl was poured out. Remember, things in this physical realm represent and cooperate with things in the spiritual realm. So when the angel pours out this bowl, of wrath on the kingdom of Babylon, and Babylon is destroyed. Well, somehow Babylon was destroyed, and now we're going to take a closer look into how Babylon was destroyed. Now, I want you to put yourself in John's shoes. He's seeing all this in these visions, these symbolic visions, and the angel's like, "Come with me." How are you feeling if you are John? You can talk about that in your groups. But he's about to see the destruction of Babylon, the kingdom of Satan, and he calls her a great prostitute or a great harlot. Prostitution in the Old Testament was linked with idolatry and false religions, and the reason why is because a lot of these prostitutes would serve as temple prostitutes, and so prostitution wasn't like what we think of today in the red light district. A lot of these prostitutes back in this time period was associated with temple worship and worshiping of other gods, and so they would go to these prostitutes for certain things, especially like when it's time to sow or it's time to harvest, and so they would act out these things with the prostitutes uh, in order to get a good harvest at the end of the harvest season or whatever. There's so many things here tied to religion and idolatry, and in the Bible, idolatry and adultery are always symbolized together. Idolatry and adultery. God sees idolatry as adultery because we are to be. He is our God. He's our God alone. And who are we to go after other gods? And so, in God's perspective, it's like we are committing adultery with God when we commit idolatry. And so, but remember that the politics and the religions are pretty much combined in this time period. It's not like today when you have separation of church and state. Church and state's not separated. This is completely united together. And so under the Antichrist, we're going to see that reestablished, a unified front of church, state, economy, socialism, intellectualism of the state, all combined into this one world order, this world system of the cosmos. And so this is going to be under that unholy trinity that we talked about: Satan, the Antichrist, and the false prophet. And so Babylon represents the capital of Satan's false political and religious system. All right, so Babylon becomes the capital or the kingdom, the main center of all of this. And so Babylon represents it represents the point, the source of all of evil in the world. And so many of the gods in the temples during the time that John is writing this had temple prostitutes. So it's very it's not surprising to me at all that God gave John a vision of this prostitute, this very seductive prostitute. She is Satan's prostitute, and she was powerful because she was controlled by Satan, or the Antichrist and the false prophet, the unholy triunity. All right, so let's look at verse 2. The kings of the world have committed adultery with her, and the people who belong to this world have been made drunk by the wine of her immorality. And so we have seen this phrasing before. Back in verse 8, when the prophecy of Babylon's fall was given, we saw this wording before. And so what John's trying to do is he's just trying to give us a direct link back to that verse in the chiasm. And so it's fitting then that we know we're backing out of the chiasm now. What does the angel mean that all the kings of the world have committed adultery with her? What does that mean? Um, you can discuss that in your groups. But one of the things it means is that all the nations of the world are basically in bed with her. They are under her influence. They are possessed by her seductive power and evil and her authority. Thus, we see here that the unbelievers have become intoxicated or have become drunk by her sexual immorality. This sexual immorality, of course, could be both sexual immorality or it could be some kind of idolatry. Remember, those two are linked together by God most of the time. And they have bought into her political, economical, religious, social, intellectual, and artistic system. They have bought into the whole package. Okay? She brings a whole package with her, and they're drunk by it. So let's look at verse 3. Verse 3, so the angel took me in the spirit into the wilderness. There I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast that had 7 heads and 10 horns, and blasphemies against God were written all over it. And so we began our chiasm with a bride being chased, the bride of Christ, being chased by a dragon. Now what do we see? We see the prostitute riding the scarlet beast. She is the opposite of the bride, and she is riding the Antichrist. The beast is the Antichrist. Let's go to verse 4. The woman wore purple and scarlet clothing and beautiful jewelry made of gold and precious gems and pearls. In her hand she held a gold goblet full of obscenities and the impurities of her immorality. So take a moment, pause, and describe this prostitute in your groups. What is she like? What is she like? All right. Well, one of the things we notice is that she's decked out and she's very seductive and she's very attractive. In some sense, she's very beautiful. And she is associated with colors of royalty and of blood, and the blood of the martyrs. She is drunk on the blood of the martyrs, the believers. Prostitutes would often wear this purple color to attract men. All right. She is holding that goblet. It's basically a really expensive wine glass. It's she's elegant. She's got these jewels, but it's full of not real wine, but it's full of obscenities and impurities of her sexual immorality or idolatry and all of that Persia that we just have been discussing. And the world is completely drunk by it. All right. Verse 5. A mysterious name was written on her forehead, Babylon the Great, mother of all prostitutes and obscenities in the world. She had this mysterious title written on her forehead. What a name. But what this indicates is she has been marked by the beast. She has Satan's mark written upon her forehead. And what does that mark say? She is the mother of all prostitutes and obscenities in the world. Uh, he's given her a pet name. Um, what a name that is. And she's probably quite proud of this name too. I imagine she's proud of it. Um, Remember, she is not a person. She represents the capital of Satan's empire, where the Antichrist is ruling from. That takes us up to verse 16. Verse 16 says, I could see that she was drunk with the blood of God's holy people who were witnesses for Jesus. I stared at her in complete amazement. And so she is drunk. And what is her drink of choice that we see? Her drink of choice is the martyrs of the saints, the blood of the martyrs. John calls the believers God's holy people. And so they stand in sharp contrast to um, of the unholy people of the world who are drunk off of her. And so they gave their lives, these holy people of God, they have given their lives for their testimony in Jesus Christ. Remember, this goes right back to Revelation 1:9, the thesis statement of Revelation. And so John stares at her in complete amazement. In your groups, why don't you discuss why you think John is staring in complete amazement? Why is John so amazed? What is he thinking? So talk about that in your groups if you want to. And then verse 7 and 8. Why are you so amazed? The angel asked. I will tell you the mystery of this woman and of the beast with the 7 heads and 10 horns on which she sits. The beast you saw was once alive, but isn't now, and yet he will soon come up out of the bottomless pit and go to eternal destruction. And the people of the world, whose names were not written in the book of life before the world was made, will be amazed at the reappearance of this beast who has died. We already know that the beast is the Antichrist. Somehow he is going to receive a deadly blow. Remember, he receives a plague. We've already discussed this. And somehow he will come back to life. And so there's this resurrection. And the people are amazed. The world is amazed. And so we see this interesting parody of God's eternality with the immortality of the beast. Up here it says the beast was and is not. The God is the one who is, the one who was, and the one who is to come. And the beast was, and then he was not, and then he is to come. But then where is he heading? He's heading right back to eternal destruction. So there's this parody of who God is and then who the beast is, and really there's no comparison. He's going to come from Hades and he's going to go right back to hell. The bottomless pit is another name for the underworld. The underworld is another name for Hades. These all are synonymous. He was destroyed by God's wrath, and he's heading right back to hell. So he is killed, he's resurrected, and then he's going right back to hell. People of his kingdom are going to be amazed at this reappearance, but believers won't be. Why will the believers not be surprised at the reappearance of the Antichrist? You can talk about that if you want, but there's a couple of possibilities. One is that the rapture might have taken place already. And so maybe the church is absent during this time. Or we could simply say that the believers won't be amazed because they're doing what they're supposed to do. They're doing exactly what Jesus asked them to do in chapter 16, which was to be watching and be ready. And so they're ready for this. They know exactly what's going to happen. We won't be surprised because God's already told us about what's going to happen in advance. That brings us up to verses 9 and 10. This calls for a mind with understanding. The 7 heads of the 7 hills where the woman rules. They also represent 7 kings. 5 kings have already fallen. The 6th now reigns, and the 7th is yet to come, but his reign will be brief. All right, so we see that the beast has 7 kingdoms under his domain. Rome was a city of 7 hills, and so each hill had its own ruler. And so if you could look at a typographical map of Rome, you would see that there's 7 high places in Rome, and each one of those were ruled by a ruler. I believe that John is trying to say that Rome is a foreshadowing of the future Babylon. 7 is the perfect number. And so I believe he's trying to say this could be literal 7. I'm not saying that this is not literal 7 rulers, but I think he's trying to say that the whole world, the perfect, uh, basically this is going to be the perfect power and authority under the Antichrist. Uh, the whole world is under the domain of the Antichrist. So there have been many antichrists before the main Antichrist comes, and there's probably still some Antichrist to come yet, but eventually this all points towards a future Antichrist. And so these kings could all represent former Antichrists who have appeared throughout history. And so they could also be referring to former empires from some of the prophetic books in the Old Testament. Thus, we have Egypt, Assyria, Babylon, Medo-Persia, and Greece. These are the ones that could have been fallen, and they have fallen, and Rome is still the one in existence in John's day. And the one that is yet to come is the final empire of the Antichrist in the final days. This is probably one of the best interpretations out there, but there's a lot of mystery here. Let's look at 11 through 13. Oh, well, first of all, let me just go through these 5 schemes. These are the 5 schemes of interpretation. You get the preterist, historicist, spiritualist, or idealist, the futurist, and the Argle, all the above interpretation. The preterists will say, this has all been fulfilled in the first century, and so this represents Rome, and the Antichrist could have been referring to. There's some disagreement in between the preterists. Actually, they're not as united as they want you to believe, but some might point to Nero, some might point to Domitian, some might point to some other leaders. Around this time period, some preterists believe that all of Revelation has been fulfilled before the year 70 AD. Some believe that it's been fulfilled before the first century. But they're going to point to some figure during that time period. The historicist normally says this is Rome. The spiritualists are idealists. They say, look, Babylon has been with us since Genesis. Babylon will continue to be with us throughout all of history until the end of the age, when Babylon, which represents Satan's reign on the earth, will finally be destroyed. And in the futurists, they say, this is a future kingdom of Antichrist where the whole world will come under his power and authority. And then, Argle, all the above. I see good points taken out of this. I definitely see Rome as being a foreshadowing. Nero committed suicide in 68 AD. There was that myth going around that Nero would be resurrected. And so, of course, John's writing after the death of Nero. And so he might be the people in the early church was thinking of Rome because, that was who was ruling in power at the time. But they might be thinking of the Emperor Domitian. But I believe that is all a foreshadowing of the future Antichrist. The historicists, they point to the Rome fell, and when Rome fell, that's where we get a lot of these historicists coming into play at the fall of Rome. Most of the early church were premillennials, and then the fall of Rome happened, and then you start getting these historicists coming into play. So they would point to Rome as fulfilling this event. And then the spiritualists, like I said, I do agree with them. I see Babylon in every age. Those are good points we can take from all of those perspectives, all 3 of those. But I also see the future Antichrist coming into power at the end of the age, and this will be the final Babylon, the final destruction of Babylon. And so they're all important. We can learn things from all of them. I don't think any of them hold all of the truth of what God's trying to reveal through Revelation here. I think you need to take them all together as a whole. All right. So, with that said, let's go on to 11 through 13. The scarlet beast that was but is no longer is the eighth king. He is like the other seven, and he too is headed for destruction. The 10 horns of the beast are 10 kings who have not yet risen to power. They will be appointed to their kingdoms for one brief moment to reign with the beast. They will all agree to give him their power and authority. You know, in prophecy, in biblical prophecy, 10 represents completeness. Is this a literal 10 kingdoms? Possibly, but it also represents the completeness. And so there are 10 future kingdoms united under the power of the Antichrist, whether that's 10 literal or just the whole, basically saying the whole world. The whole world is going to be united under the Antichrist. The whole world is going to give their allegiance to the Antichrist. Their reign will be short because the reign of the Antichrist will be short. In the Greek, it says 1 hour. His reign will last for 1 hour. Now, the hour used is a figure of speech. It doesn't literally mean 1 hour. So, hardly anybody believes that this is 1 hour. I don't know anyone who believes this is just 1 hour. But 1 hour is a figure of speech. It means in the blink of an eye. He'll rule for a minute. And so this could be, 3.5 years, 7 years, whatever, depending on what background you come from. But it could be up to one generation. He will rule for a minute. Why? Why will he rule for a minute? Well, we're about to figure out why. Verse 14. Together they will go to war against the Lamb, but the Lamb will defeat them, because he is the Lord of all lords and King of all kings, and he and his called and chosen and faithful one will be with him. He'll only rule for a minute because the real King of Kings is coming. The real Lord of Lords is coming. King of Kings was the title of the Persian emperor, and Lord of Lords was the title of the Roman emperor. And so basically John's saying, nuh-uh, the real King of Kings and the real Lord of Lords is coming back. And he is going to defeat the powers of darkness once and for all. And this is the Battle of Armageddon. We already looked at the Battle of Armageddon in the 7 Bowls of Wrath, but remember, we're taking a closer look at the destruction of Babylon. Remember, they are gathered together in Armageddon by powerful demonic forces in chapter 16, verses 13 through 16. So who comes with Jesus? Who is with him? The church is with him. The church is coming with Jesus. He calls them his called, chosen, and faithful. You have been called. You have been called. You have been chosen, and you are called to remain faithful. Now, another thing you can discuss in your groups, what is your calling? We've all been called. What is your calling? What is your purpose? What kind of vocation is God calling you into? You can discuss that in your groups. Let's look at verse 15. The angel said to me, the waters where the prostitute is ruling represent masses of people of every nation and language. Water usually represents masses of people in prophecy, or sometimes it can represent chaos. But Babylon has replicated what rightfully belongs to the world, to God. And so there are people from every nation represented. Every nation, every tongue are represented here, just like God's trying to do. And so uh, Satan is the counterfeit. He is the thief. He's a liar. He's a cheater, and he is a destroyer. And so basically, he is the counterfeit of God, and that's what we see in this verse. Verse 6. All right, so here is verse 16. The scarlet beast and his 10 horns hate the prostitute. They will strip her naked, eat her flesh, and burn her remains with fire. Tell us how you really feel. How do they feel about her? They absolutely hate her. This is the opposite of God. This is clearly the opposite. Are you surprised that Babylon is going to be treated like this in the end? No, we're not surprised. How does God feel about his bride? Well, he absolutely loves her, and Jesus gave his life for her. And so here's that complete opposite. We just see that continuing on in this verse, that Satan represents the complete opposite of God. And so how are they going to treat her? They're going to defile her. They're going to abuse her. They're going to sacrifice her to Satan. They are going to destroy her. And so they have become instruments in the hands of God. Just like Babylon became an instrument in the hands of God during the judgment upon Israel, the Antichrist and his 10 horns are also going to destroy Babylon in the last days. That brings us up to verses 17 and 18. So here we have verse 17 and 18. For God has put a plan into their minds, a plan that will carry out his purposes. They will agree to give their authority to the scarlet beast, and so the words of God will be fulfilled. And this woman you saw in your vision represents the great city that rules over the kings of the world. And so now the angel is finished showing John his vision within the vision. He has shown John exactly what is going to take place during the 5th bowl of wrath that will be poured out on the kingdom of Babylon. And so we see that God is in complete control, and he has placed this plan into their minds to destroy her. The rulers will destroy Babylon under the commission of God. And so of course, they don't know that this was God's plan, but it is, because God is sovereign. He is in ultimate and complete control. And, one of the things that this should do, if you are a believer, is this should give you hope that God's purposes cannot be thwarted. God has a purpose and a plan for your life, and no matter what Satan tries to do, that purpose and that plan cannot be thwarted. Does that bring you hope? Talk about that in your groups if you want to. So that's going to bring me up to the conclusion here. There is no easy interpretation for Revelation chapter 17 and 18. There are a lot of different interpretations for this chapter throughout the centuries. There have been tons of interpretations. That has represented Rome, the Roman Catholic Church, the Protestant Church, Jerusalem, this real city of Babylon, the Middle East, Israel. The list goes on and on according to your scheme of interpretation. The preterist, the historicist, the spiritualist, and the futurist. The preterist, they like to say that this represents Rome, and there is no doubt that Rome is a foreshadowing of the future Babylon. And in the historicists, they like to point out to different kingdoms that represent these 10 future kingdoms of the Antichrist. And in the futurists, they point out to the fact that there is going to be a future Antichrist who is going to establish the final kingdom of Babylon that God is going to destroy in the end. And so uh, there will be this future kingdom of the Antichrist. Now, that's why I use the all the above approach. The spiritualists too, who see, that there's been a Babylon in every generation. They rise and they fall. They get crushed down by God, and then another one rises up. But I do, as a futurist, I do see a future Babylon rising up in power, the final one that will lead to God's final confrontation between good and evil before Jesus Christ returns. There are truths in each one of these schemes, and a lot of it is going to remain a mystery until that happens. But because we are doing what Jesus tells us to do, we are watching and we are waiting. We'll know when that day comes exactly who the Antichrist is and who Babylon is, and where that kingdom is located. But until that happens, let's be respectful of one another's views and just admit that we're not omniscient like God is, and we don't know all the answers, and there is still a lot of mystery in the book of Revelation. And so this week we've studied chapter 17. Next week we will finish chapter 18. We'll take a look a little bit more into detail over Babylon again, um, which is because we're backing our way out of the chiasm. You're probably thinking, well, this doesn't sound like it's been structured or ordered very well, but it has if you look at it from the structure of the chiasm. So I'll see you next week. God bless. Thanks for watching.